You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
Hello, listeners. Ken Vellante here with the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and pleased to welcome back Elle Nash, who was, I looked up the dates, Elle, October 2023, which is last 2 centuries ago, episode number 228, and had a great conversation with you then, and just like, hey, like, welcome back to the show and talk some smart things.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's good to be here. Yeah, it does feel like it was in the last century. January itself, everyone's been making this joke, but it feels like it's been 100 days long. And I'm like, yeah, it has.
It has.
There's just so much going on. It's
Empirically, that's probably not true, but it really is. We're gonna just chat about some different things, in a bit about as we get into the reception of your book, Deliver Me, which I had the opportunity to read and listen to. Nice rendition, audio rendition as well.
Awesome.
Yeah. So when we talked, your book was coming out. It was right around when it was coming out, and what I wanted to ask, just from you as the author and the creator of this, and first of all, let me say a couple things about the book. Phenomenal. I heard your description of like trying to maybe harangue or get your voice into a more, I don't know, regular novel format, and just I love that because I like poetry and the lyricism, but I adore novels, and when there's all that space there, I could feel and read some of the things you were going through. But that was your big, like, I think you call it like bad bitch novel. Like, this is like, here it is. And here's how you're supposed to do it. Visceral. And when I talked to you before, I mentioned I've been a vegan for quite some time, and visceral even so much on bodies, tearing of bodies, blood everywhere. And it was really great to recently see Deliver Me recognized by the publication Granta, which I was like, I wrote to you quickly and said, holy shit, like that's like literary chops there. All right. What about what about the reception of Deliver Me? What's the experience been for you as the author creator?
Yeah, it's been really good. It's a bit weird because it came out October 2023 in the States, and then I did like my short tour for that. And then it was great. I mean, a lot of that just felt a bit like being able to kind of go home and hang out with friends and also meet a lot of people that I'd known online for years and years, which was really cool. Wild to read my work at the Franklin Park reading series, which was like a packed house. And it's just a wild experience to reflect on that in terms of where I was when I first started writing and how I felt, and really like feel grateful, for how far I was able to go. And then it was released in the UK just this summer of 2024. And that's also been really incredible. I feel like it connects with readers almost in a different way here. It was more intently marketed as horror, like a type of thriller novel. And I think that put me into the hands of a lot of very like young and really hungry readers, which was exciting to see that. And which has been really great. And it was also longlisted for Scotland's National Book Award, which I just did not really expect, but I also feel like it gives me a lot of warmth because like I've chosen to make Scotland my home, and I've said a lot that the longer I live here, the more I'm like, this really feels like the only place that's felt like a home, because I was a military brat. I kind of grew up outside of like everyone's culture in a way, and here I'm like, I feel like I belong and I have great community. And I think to have my work, like not being a Scottish author and the book not even being based in Scotland, be long listed like for a national award feels pretty
I want to stop
amazing.
you. I want to stop you. There's that. No, I didn't even know that piece of it. Congratulations. I think there's so much there about what you have to say about the recognition of it, particularly, as outsider status or feelings of that, but also belonging. But
Yeah.
I can't imagine that feeling when you're somewhere else and they're like, this is in the language outside of all the politics. This is, and I'm happy to hear that. So
Yeah.
you're
Thank
talking
you.
about over there, maybe some contact unexpected with the younger readership,
Mhm.
horror, and then as far as the U.S. in your interaction and feeling with it, has it been a different, kind of like different vibe or different things?
I don't know. It's hard to say. Part of it's tough because I don't know where how far the book spreads or who's reading it per se, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But I do feel like it's been a good way to like break into that horror world and like see what else is out there. Like I think it's been reaching there. I just think the publisher kind of market it more as like a literary fiction novel, rather than specifically something that is more genre. And that makes sense because it doesn't really have like specific genre conventions, right? It kind of like lives in between. But I think what I've seen or what I suspect is that it seems like the UK like literary culture is a little bit more forgiving of things that don't fit neatly inside of particular boxes. So that's been really nice. And maybe I'm just seeing it more as well because I live here now. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Of course. No, I think, I mean, in genre and categories, I'm sure every interview you grapple with that. And it's like, I don't know what it is. And music,
Hmm.
like, I don't know.
Hmm.
But I think horror, only just in the sense, not even like genre wise, but just like within the visceral reactions I had to it, right? Of seeing, of being placed in the position of seeing. And I think there's something, this is a philosophy podcast. There's something just really incredible about the connection between that kind of organic slaughter, blood, and the mechanics of the timer that I've heard you point out, but are in the book. But just the idea of the mechanization of the death, in counting time by deaths. There's just kind of this combination on time of like the mechanical and the horror, like in front of. At least for your main character's work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. And it feels,
um,
I mean, it feels very pertinent. And I think it still feels pertinent to me as well. Even like not even necessarily being vegan, but thinking about like the mechanization of like how things are created to produce, themselves in order to become consumed and how it's like kind of on a conveyor belt of only ever increasing productivity. I thought about this recently because I just saw this like I saw some graph, like there's always infographics floating around about there was like all these arguments on Twitter all the time about whether or not people should be paid like a living wage and how the federal living wage hasn't increased since I don't know like 1998 or something. It's still like 7.25 an hour, and yet like outputs on worker productivity have been only steadily increasing. And I kind of think about it in the same way, even like metaphorically, if you think about the way that they are not just like genetically modifying and breeding chickens to pack on more and more like meat onto their
yeah,
bodies, but
yeah,
even after that they still will in the like right after they'll like pump them full of saline to make them look even plumper, but it's not real, right? It's kind of like it's a false image of how much meat is really there, because then if you ever cook it, all that weird white stuff comes out, like that's
and
all
it's
like the saline.
yeah, it's like the filling, like the female bodies too, and that too, like just that
Yeah.
kind of um I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there, but and just there's this kind of artificiality and to it. One of the pieces when you're talking about this mechanization, I remember there's a philosopher, last name Spencer, who did all these famous time studies at the early 20th century. And these were things like workers processing and doing all these things down and lighting, and use all this stuff to scientifically study productivity and output. And what was fascinating to me is Vladimir Lenin became fascinated with this, and not in a way that I think kind of twisted the way history went. It was kind of like almost like that type of productivity for the state. Like
Hmm.
it was as fascinated by it. So if you're still looking at workers, I don't know. I don't know how I got
Hmm.
to that point, but I was just saying, as far as how you look at time and like what that's meant for, and like politically, like what the aims are
Hmm.
of that. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, it's very much like, I mean, it's very much as like it's looking at the human like as a resource for either the corporation or the state. And it makes me think, I mean, that's like when I think about human resources, it's like not that maybe every person in human resources like believes that that's the case, but like the human resource department is there because it's facilitating humans as a resource, you know?
I know.
Yeah.
All right. So much to talk about.
Hmm.
Let's keep. David Lynch. David Lynch
Hmm.
passed away,
Hmm.
and I haven't really dealt with that. Like, and we're recording here in February 2025, and like super, just I don't know. Words can't describe for me. But like, I do have a simple question for you. I guess I'm going to ask you, Ed. As far as David Lynch art, painting, photography, film, complicated depictions of women, heroines. What does David Lynch mean to you, Elle Nash, as a creator and artist?
Yeah. See, I came to David Lynch quite late in my life because, like, for example, everyone I knew that knew about Twin Peaks is like they watched it as a kid or like their parents watched it or something. And my parents never did. I like never knew that this was a thing. Like, if you would have told me it was a national sensation at the time when it came out, I was like, I just don't, I've always been shielded from that. And I kind of wonder if, like, I kind of want to ask like my parents and be like, did you watch this? And like, I didn't know because I'm like, how did we miss this huge like cultural moment?
Yeah,
But for me, I mean, he does mean a lot to me in part because he is such a huge proponent of the desire to create and also the fundamental belief that you don't have to suffer to create and
yeah,
or to make, you know, to art that depicts suffering. And that's like been a thing I think that I've struggled with like on a spiritual sense for many years. That like even I think like last year I did like a sense of therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy for a while, and one of the questions like for the goals I came up with the therapist was, I'm going to try to finally unwrap this idea that I have to be suffering to like make good art. And then when we got through a lot of other stuff, she was like, do you still want to work on this? And I was like, you know what? I don't think I do. I was like, I think I'll,
yeah,
you know, I was like, I think I'm going to work it out in the art rather than like the therapy. But I still think about it a lot. But I think continuously coming back to Lynch and him being a proponent of meditation, and specifically like, you know, transcendental meditation, but any meditation for me is important. It just gives me a kind of faith and hope that I can continue to make positive progress on myself, like do my inner work, and that it's
yeah,
not going to damage my desire or ability to create, but hopefully like deepen it. But it's a fear, you know, like that's a real fear. And I think that's what he means to me. Um, like, even so, I remember the first time I watched Mulholland Drive, I was like, I think I was just so amazed at how maybe it's just like me being naive, but I was like so amazed at like how progressive it was in terms of like the complicated women and also it being like super gay and all this. Like I was like, I had no idea. And I just feel like there's, you know, for me, like growing up, I was like, oh man, I would have died to see these kinds of films when I was like a teenager or like in my very early 20s, you know? So like that also is inspiring. And I don't know, I also just kind of I love that he forces you to like question like the abstract nature of his films without like with refusing to explain it in a way. But he does it in a way that's like, there's other filmmakers that do this, like Ari Aster is another one, but I just feel like Ari Aster is just like not as good at it. And almost he like kind of ruins his own films sometimes. But not that his films are bad. Like they are, you know, like Beau is Afraid was like pretty brilliant, except for like one thing that I hated. But I feel like Lynch like just did a great job of being like, no, like the cinema is where it is and that's where it lives. And there's no, you know, I'm not going further than that. This is where I'm expressing this, which is admirable and also frustrating probably for like every single art student out there who's forced to write about all of the reasons why they do things in their work.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me, particularly with some of the training. I mean, there's an absurdity to some of the questions, like you answered the last time we talked, you know, what is art? Why is there something rather than nothing? And I always seen within like Lynch that there's this kind of like joking spirit, right? Like,
Yeah.
You know, can you explain, you know, why you did that? No.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like the evidence is in front of you, and that's so inviting. But I think one of the things that's come up definitely as a theme throughout the entire show is exactly what you mentioned. Is like it's not a either or, but it has something to do with like how you create from like in David Lynch would be like place of peace and that you're observing things going past you. Where like in Suffering, it's almost like you're wrestling with demons, you're creating your demons. There's like addiction and terror and like grabbing at it. And, you know, I think people feel intuitively the approach or the way it should be is David Lynch, and maybe that's the way it all is, but it's like mixed up for folks, right? Like of how they're inspired to create. But I think it's really important what David Lynch pointed out for artists, because the kind of culture of death and suffering for the creators is can be like a really tough burden, right? If that's the only like way, you know. I always think of Russian literature when I'm thinking of the opposite side of it, and Dostoevsky of like intense suffering, intense Christian suffering, and
Yeah.
anguish, and anguish, and then story.
Yeah. Like, was Dostoevsky okay?
Yeah, I mean, you know, hey, large question. Are words losing meaning? Like nowadays, like I don't know, last few years politically, I go around and you hear, and it's not just hearing and seeing weird things, but trying to words seem to be looser. Have they lost meaning? Have they lost meaning recently?
Do you mean like in the sense of how we've come to have like an internetization of our language, or do
Yeah.
you mean like the intent behind them?
Well, I mean, I would say is clumsy in as many syllables as like pull it together. Internetization, like that maybe think about it in the terms of like intellectually, that like where the forums to communicate things, and what meanings words are accepted to have in like discourse in like 2025. Does it make any sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I understand what you're saying. I've actually had a lot of thoughts about this, and I feel like it's like one day I want to write about this somehow, where there, because those forums reward virality, you know, what happens is like, you know, when you get like a phrase that becomes a meme, and like that phrase is something like, I wish I could think of some like right off the top of my head.
Used to come
But
out of like Saturday Night Live and stuff like that. Some sort of funny, like catchy saying.
yeah, and then now it will be like me and who, you know, or whatever, like those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And a lot of these phrases, what happens is, I've thought about this a lot. And maybe it's like you could call it like the TikTokification of language, where a phrase becomes a meme, like it goes viral, and then what happens is like it kind of gets in your head, And then when it gets in your head, one thing that I think is really interesting is that I feel like there's the reason why I think it's not like dangerous, like we should all like run away from it or ban it, but more like I think there's like almost an internal danger to it in terms of like how language helps us think and like helps us be free. Because I think that it collapses our mode of expression into something that's really simple. It's like a simple packet of information. And then and then when we express it, we're like reconfirming for ourselves that we're expressing it through this very limited packet of information rather than
Yeah.
like our own natural like voice or thought patterns. And I almost think like if you do like I try to stay off Twitter now a bit because of this. I think like if you do it too much, you almost like limit your ability to think more outside of this realm,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of fascinating to me because I think it's more than just like using slang or anything like that. It's not like slang for something, but it's more like how we take this huge thing that could be expressible in like these various ways, but then it becomes like collapsed this way, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do think like, yeah, I do think that is happening a lot. And I do sometimes find that when I go online and I'm like reading threads or I'm reading forums, but specifically when it's like on a place where a lot of arguments are happening, like Twitter, I'll find myself like struggling a bit to be like, what are they like actually saying? Like, am I dumb? Like, am I not getting this? And it's not in a way of not understanding the slang or their intent. It's more like my actual comprehension of it is like, I think this is what they're saying, but like I can't be sure. And there's a lot of things going on there. Part of it is like not understanding intent. It's also not having like the massive other amount of information you get from communicating with someone like in person or face to face. But it's also just like that. I think it is that collapsing of the ways that things are expressed that make it like harder in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about like exchange in there, I think, too. Like about like almost like market exchange and what's used to like enter. Like there's this narrowing of like how you can frame complicated thought that might be in your head through the interface that people would consider it via like image or text or
Yeah.
like
Yeah, it is.
yeah.
Yeah. It is a narrowing. You're right. I was just thinking that because of the way that like those packets have to exist. You can't possibly try to make it all encompassing. And then if you don't make it all encompassing, you still get like attacked from all these like little different angles on it. So it becomes hard to even just have a deeply nuanced conversation, which I think in some ways, because the way that our brains work with building neural pathways and like how, once a thought goes, it's like building that little bridge. You do that enough. And then that I think it has an effect inside the mind, right? Like it's not just how we're interacting
Yep.
with it. It's changing us as we're interacting with it day on day on day. It's very interesting. I don't know if it's like, if language is dying per se, but it is, I don't know how I feel about it. It makes me want to protect my brain.
No, like I don't have like even on the answer to that, but I think part of I just think of disruption. I think it's like up to like maybe like poetry to queer it up or like like because for me, I don't know if the word is reduction, but there's always like a beautiful reduction of poetry to pull the extremely complicated or like the feeling that are within there and grab it all and with like economy and pizzazz. I don't know. That's a real but there's something there about the form of communication that can kind of disrupt just this easy exchange or maybe more vacuous. Wow. Well, you're working on that one. So when you get the answer to that one finished in your how's the goth book club going on your Patreon? How's that going?
So I paused it last semester because I'm teaching now at a university just as like a graduate teaching assistant. And so I just paused it because I was like, I just need like a break. But I have just restarted it, and all of it's now on Substack, which I just feel is a little bit easier. It's easier to communicate with people, and like get it out. And the next meeting we're having is on the 23rd of February, which is a Sunday, and we're talking about Eileen Wuornos. There's a collected letters put out by Soft Skull Press, I believe.
There is?
Of letters that she wrote to her childhood best friend, Dawn, while she was in prison awaiting her execution. And I just started the book, and it's really good so far. Like, I really enjoy it. I love reading letters.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, yes, I'm going to look for that one too. Yeah. Talk about a cool book club. Come on, folks. No, check it. I always see that. I always love the name and love seeing that.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a lot of fun. So Elle, when I was listening to you talk about your writing and your creation of characters, and there's something too about the David Lynch question I had in my head around this type of time. And the couple concepts I had about like thinking about characters or people. If we start like with like the Lynch, the idea that it goes way back in the Tibetan culture, the tulpa, which is like this kind of like formless mass clay. I think of the golem in Jewish tradition, but of this clay. And the idea of, within this body or mass is that there's this intense meditation that can vivify or give some form of life to, either in the form of it breaking into a horror or of it given consciousness of that, of a duplicate or a model or a friend. So that's like one distinct concept. And the other concept I was thinking about when it comes to like characters and people and how they're formed in real and in fiction is like the concept Tibetan Buddhism, the skandhas, bundle, almost like the idea of like bundles of sticks. You can even think about the rope around the sticks. So we have like this concentration that is Elle, that is Ken, collected in this way, but it's really like a myriad of perceptions, ideas, outbursts, creativity, so I was just thinking about it in that type of backdrop, and maybe with the Lynch stuff of maybe thinking about your characters and the formation of them, and if whether those two approaches kind of an interface for you to talk about them.
That's a really good question. I have actually, so I do meditate a lot, and I do a lot of like kind of ritual practice stuff that you could classify as like magic, but always talking about magic sometimes feels like cheesy, which is funny because people are like, oh, it's magic. But for me, I've never thought about like character creation as like a thought form that you are like bundling off as part of your psyche in a way. This is really interesting. Like tulpas are curious to me because they kind of they're similar to like in chaos magic, what you would call like a servitor or like an egregore, where it's like this thing that you are constantly thinking about and feeding in a way. And it's like this portion of your mind that you are like bundling off, and then kind of snipping, and it's still somewhat a part of you, but then it's also separate in its own thing. Right. And like, I've always thought about that stuff in terms of like magic when like I have a particular goal in mind, or I'm wanting to get something done, and I'm using rituals to like help me get there. But I've never thought about specifically doing that like in my fiction in terms of like how I'm interacting with them and like thinking about it in that structure. It's almost like, I guess when I'm writing and I'm creating characters, they do like live in their world, but they're all, I don't know. This is a really good question. I'm like, are they part of me or not? I think one thing I've always said...
I'm not supposed to complicate any of your processes either by these questions.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting. I really like it. Well, the thing is like, I've always said... So as someone who's like written, I guess what you could call autofiction, there's always been like that, you know, argument of like, well, is this you or is this not? What's true and what's not true? And I've always sat and believed, like, once I put that person on the page, it doesn't matter if it's me or even if something I've written about has happened in my real life. That page, that person on that page is completely separate from me. Like, that's a different kind of thing. And that's not just for me to like get some free pass or whatever. It's more just like what I am creating is completely, I've always seen it as something that's completely separate from like myself, like what you would call, I guess, that skanda, like that bundle of like ego, personal identity, or whatever. But my beliefs and my processes are always changing. And recently I've been thinking a lot more about like how when we interact with things, we're really not separate from them at all. You know, like we create like a word boundaries because psychologically it's important and safe for us to stay grounded. But when you go deeper, like when you're meditating and you're thinking about consciousness and non-duality and you go deeper into it, that boundary actually kind of doesn't really exist. However, it's considered like a conventional truth in Buddhism to say that this boundary does exist in the real world so we can maintain our lives at the same time while we are doing this kind of practice. And so I'm like, I don't know, maybe it's not that separate, or maybe I should be like thinking more about my characters in this kind of state. I wonder what would like happen with the work if I did that. It's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, I love that. I
Yeah.
love the conversation. I wanted to tell you, being my background and training is literature. It's just books. I think maybe just call it books. You know, outside of the other stuff that I do. But for me, there is a piece of this in this question that, at least at this moment, like it really brings me to a particular book and particular author, and The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner. And the reason why I think that is maybe I was just reminded of it because I think it's in public access. What do you call that now? The copyright is expired, or you know, so it's like it's in the public domain. But there's something about that structure I thought about in time of like at that time you had like the of Einstein and quantum physics, and you had all these disruptive questions of space and time. But I also think like right at that time it had something to do with the bundles or impressions in the short chapters. Like there would be impressionistic chapters. So like I always thought of that book going back as this kind of like maybe non-unified ego revolutionary type of structural thing. Anyways, that's my homage to Faulkner and what I thought, you know, about this. But yeah, it's just interesting. That word's a little mundane, but just like to encounter this type of thought and how I was thinking of it in terms of like your writing and your comments about your writing. So, yeah, love it.
Yeah, I've never read Faulkner, so maybe I should just to see. But yeah, that's really interesting. I'm kind of obsessed with quantum physics theory and stuff too, in terms of thinking about consciousness and how we can affect consciousness and like the very concrete reasons why meditation or ritual, for example, is so interesting and affecting like on the mind. In part because, I mean, I don't know, there's a lot there, and I'm not like a scientist, so I can't really say for sure, but even just the idea of like how when we observe a particle, it changes. That process of observation changes it from like a sound to, or like a wave to like a particle or whatever that process is. Yeah. But if you think about just that process of observation, when you are sitting and meditating, like that's part of what you're doing. You're just observing. And then through observing, like the relationship changes, like something's changing there. And I'm just very fascinated by that and questions of whether or not we actually have free will, you know, and or you know what I mean, or if we do, how much control do we have, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I like that in the terms of like being able to observe within meditation is like the thoughts, the ideas, that which was so important becomes like less important to you. And one of the best visuals for me has always been when I was trained to like snip the strings of the balloons that are like all up in here, and snipping those strings, and kind of like they float off and you can kind of just like see them in a different way. And I've always liked how like, you know, at Buddhism, like we can both like, do the 2,000 page like book of like deep dedication, or like we can see something goofy or get hit by an apple and be like, oh shit, like I get it now. So no, it's really nice to talk to you about that stuff. And I think for me, like, not to overplay, and I know some folks have done it like critically, but for me, I think there's something in my head about that. There's this intersection of like really a queering up of Newtonian physics with like quantum mechanics, and like I think that novel right around plays with that, and so it becomes a philosopher's dream. So, Elle, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for chatting again, and thanks for everything you create. And I'm sure we'll chat again soon, and like, and we'll kick it around again. So thank you so much for popping on again.
I really appreciate it. It's a good conversation.
Take care, Elle.
Thanks.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing.
And listeners, to stay connected with us and our guests, visit somethingratherthannothing.com. Join our mailing list for exclusive updates and access to guest-created art. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a review on your podcast platform. People really read that shit. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread our community across the planet. This is a global show, and we like to give a shout out to our many listeners across the world, including many listeners in Canada, Spain, Germany, UK, Argentina, Brazil, India, Thailand, and so many more places. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast for behind-the-scenes content. And the best way to help the show is to tell your friends about us. If you love it, they'll love it too. Tell your friends who love it. We love you. This is Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast.